Good evening. Welcome to this week's segment on Cuban identity. Throughout history, European ideals have seeped into Cuba's culture, beginning with Spain's colonial rule that was accompanied by the cultural identity from Africa. These European ideals caused separation and stigma among the racially diverse nation that shaped the culture. Eventually, however, Cuba's mixed heritage provided a source of nationalism, unity, and pride that continues to thrive today. When Spain initially invaded Latin America in the early 1500s, Latin Americans were forced to abandon religious, economic, and cultural preferences to make room for the new Spanish way. Latin American churches were destroyed while Spanish held mass baptisms without even teaching the roots of Christianity. The native language was overtaken by Spanish, Spanish-style governments were implemented, and social injustices became prevalent all over Latin America. Conquerors cultivated relations with the pre-existing communities, and many married and had children with the native nobles. This mix of politics, culture, and race produced a new culture that was unlike any before. This variety, though initially causing a divide, set the stage for the strong sense of nationalism, unity, and pride in the future. With us today is Yale Professor of Latin American Cultural Studies, Mia Zayas. Professor Zayas, you have spent a lot of time studying these relations and the causes and effects of Latin American nationalism. Could you explain to our viewers tonight how this colonialism and new definition of identity in Latin America affected Cuba?
Thank you for having me here this evening, Ms. Aliardi. This distinction between racial sects in Cuba first became prevalent in the early 19th century during the rebellions for independence. In Latin American countries, Cuba especially, a divide arises between the Iberian-born Spaniards, who were then called peninsulars, and the native-born people known as Creoles. These two groups of people competed with one another socially. Simply because the peninsulars were born in Spain, they became the imperial rulers. With this, they were given governmental offices, access to wealth, and more distinctly, power over the Creoles. But even more worse off were those who had African, indigenous, or even mixed descent. The European caste system put the mixed people, or mestizos, at the bottom of the totem pole. This, of course, gave the oppressed Cuban people a motive to rebel. But in order to rebel against Spain, these people needed to be unified. Pride and nationalism is what ended up bringing Cuban people from a wide spectrum, from African slaves to Quechua-speaking villagers and landowners of pure Spanish blood to mestizo artisans. That feeling of pride and nationalism shaped an entire region of Latin Americans, especially in Cuba in the 20th century. Cuban people began to take pride in their mixed heritage, which they still refer to as being from dos patrias, or two homelands, which references Africa and Spain, or Spain and Cuba. That specific idea of dos patrias seeped in from revolutionary artists such as José Martí. Martí himself was a Cuban poet whose works explored the concepts of liberty. He went on to influence other Latin American artists and revolutionaries.
So how have we seen the idea of nationalism and pride in Cuba with respect to the Cuban Revolution?
This sense of identity deepened further during and after the Cuban Revolution with the Castro brothers. After the Castros took control of Cuba, that sense of pride and revolution reverberated across the country and further across Latin America. Cuba became a symbol for revolution and identity in young Latin Americans, affecting an entire generation. And these feelings that unified a Cuban nation still exist today and will continue to live on as we look back to Cuba's past.
Thank you, Professor. Speaking of the modern Cuban identity, we're now going to go to Andrea Kinsler live in Cuba's capital. Andy? Oh, we're recording?
12 seconds later.
Hello, I'm here in Havana, Cuba, inside the Revolutionary Museum, where presidents from Medical to Batista have lived. This art behind me is a symbol of revolution and pride for many Cubans, this building having hosted many riots during the Cuban Revolution. With me right now is Cuban native Rosa Garcia. Rosa.
Hola.
Hola, Rosa. What role does Cuban identity play in your life?
Well, Cuba is a very diverse and accepting country. I personally am mixed. My mom is Cuban and my dad is African, and so I embrace traditions and cultural values from both of these races. My community is very supportive, and understanding make it easier for me to open up.
And as a native, can you describe how all of these influences have helped shape the island's identity today?
See. That fusion of races in Cuba has definitely led to lots of cultural exchange that influences many aspects of Cuban life. For example, music is a big part of Cuban identity that assimilates that mash of races. Other aspects include popular Cuban literature with themes of identity and mixing of races. These aspects highlight the acceptance of diversity in Cuban identity and how that plays a role in even the most basic aspects of daily life.
And as you probably know, Cuba-U.S. relations are starting to pick up again, with the possibility of the U.S. ending its embargo that has been in place since 1962.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests and instead we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
How do you think these new relations are impacting Cuba presently and possibly in the future?
As of now, Cubans are very eager to share our culture with Americans. We are also excited for more internet access and the economic boom that the tourism industry will bring. In the near future, my only concern is that the influx of tourism may take away Cuba's rich culture, but I don't think it will ever take away from our pride on how far our country has come.
Muchas gracias, Mrs. Garcia. Back to you, Mary Rose.
Thank you, Andrea. See you again next week for our segment on cultural identity in Costa Rica. Adios!
Siempre hay alguien